During my 6 years in Canada, 2 years as a postdoctoral theologian in Vancouver and 4 years as a religious studies professor in Ontario, I tried to follow the public discussion on abortion. The most astonishing observation I made was that there was no public discussion on abortion in Canada, or that it was a bizarre meta discussion about whether you're allowed to have a discussion or a debate at all. Symptomatic of this peculiar silence was, unsurprisingly, a stupendous public ignorance about abortion legislature in Canada, and about the uglier side of abortion clinics. For example, few Canadians heard anything about Dr. Ulrich Klopfer, the American abortion doctor whose case caught the attention of even European newspapers. Dr. Klopfer, whose license was suspended in 2015 due to multiple serious health and safety violations, died a few years ago. After his death, the body parts of some 2,246 babies, euphemistically called fetal remains, were found tucked away and stored in his private home. And later they found quite a few more in his trunk. The eerie Canadian silence around abortion was noted and lambasted remarkably, I think once, by the Canadian journalist Jonathan Kay in what can be only called a historic article published in the National Post. He writes, "An observer from any other country," I was from any other country, "would find it completely bizarre." Mr. Kay, a self-described atheist and I believe a progressive liberal, pointed to recent polls that showed that the majority of Canadians, some 61%, favored some restrictions on abortion, which meant that the restrictionless status quo represented presently in law actually represents a minority view in Canada. Kay writes, "I'm pro-choice in my own personal outlook, but as a journalist, I find this state of play to be shocking. I know of no other policy issue that features such a massive disjunction between elite-enforced orthodoxy and the actual views of ordinary Canadians." In a matter-of-fact way, as if it were blatantly obvious to anyone paying the slightest attention, he lays much of the blame for both the bizarre silence and the massive disjunction on his own profession, the journalists. He then says something equally fascinating. While the ranks of abortion opponents traditionally have been dominated by religious Christians, it's the pro-choice side that now channels the spirit of Inquisition. Whether or not this two-part claim is true, it serves as a brilliant lead to the actual topic of my talk today, which is namely abortion and religion. As a religious studies scholar and a theologian and an ethicist, I've chosen to ask, analyze, and answer this question: is abortion a religious issue? Is abortion a religious issue? There, I've now asked it, and I'm 1/3 finished. No and yes. Not really. Well, kind of. There, I've now answered it. We're 2/3 there. I've asked and answered my question. All that is left is the middle part, the analysis itself. Bear with me. At this point, I'd like to turn from Canada to the United States, which is my new adopted country. A country with fewer taboos, whether we like to admit it or not. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Bernard Nathanson. Like the infamous Dr. Ulrich Klopfer, he too was an abortion doctor, actually a formidable pioneer in the field. In fact, in 1969, Dr. Bernard Nathanson co-founded NARAL, the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, which later, after it had successfully lobbied its name redundant, was cleverly renamed the National Abortion Rights Action League, known today as NARAL Pro-Choice America. Their major victory was, of course, Roe versus Wade in 1973. The plaintiff, under the alias Jane Roe, her real name was Norma McCorvey, beat the Texan attorney Henry Wade in the U.S. Supreme Court's landmark vote in her favor 7-2. The ruling helped to formulate and establish the trimester system. No prohibition on abortion for the first trimester, with increasing restrictions towards birth. The debate around abortion, however, never ceased, as we know. Roe versus Wade was revoked, and at least in the U.S. the debate rages on, and I believe in most Western nations in its wake as well, with these nations roughly divided into so-called pro-life and pro-choice camps. I will return to Dr. Nathanson and Norma McCorvey at the end of my talk. The ranks of abortion opponents, Jonathan Kay, the journalist, wrote in that remarkable article, have traditionally been dominated by religious Christians. Allow me to draw your attention to his carefully chosen words, traditionally and religious Christians. First, traditionally. Things are much more complicated nowadays as opposed to traditionally. Recent polls in the US show that 20%, 1/5 of the pro-life camp, self-identifies as non-religious, as atheists and agnostics. We're talking about millions and millions of people. Pro-life, non-religious organizations have cropped up, several of them. Secular pro-life, pro-life humanists, new wave feminists, and so on. Most of them run and spearheaded by women. Women like Kelsey Hazard, Christine Kruselinsky, and Destiny Herndon de la Rosa. In fact, I may have butchered some of those names, I apologize. In fact, it's probably more than 20%. Jonathan Kay's perceptive descriptor, religious Christians, presupposes the distinction between religious Christians, in other words, practicing Christians, and nominal Christians, Christians in name only. Of the 80% of pro-lifers who self-identify as Christian, probably many, millions, are actually nominal Christians, functionally atheist or agnostic. This makes interpreting the percentage very tricky. Whatever the exact figure, two striking implications follow. The first is this: pro-life is clearly not a religious stance. Not if so many atheists can subscribe to it. However, and this is the second implication, pro-life attitudes are nevertheless clearly overrepresented among the religious. How do we explain these two implications, these two empirical facts? When people work towards formulating their own position on abortion, they tend to ask themselves two questions. I'm here streamlining what's usually a long and complex ethical deliberation, but they tend to ask two questions about the organism growing inside a pregnant mother's womb? What is it, and can you kill it? These are the key questions. Let's briefly look at each in turn. First, what is it? Dr. Glenn Cohen, the professor of law at Harvard University, notes that in order to answer this, we must break it into three smaller questions. Is it alive? Is it human? And is it a person? Now this makes much sense. These are very good questions. If an organism is, say, not alive, but it is human, it's a corpse. If it is alive, but say a cat, it's not human. Ever since the invention of the ultrasound and modern genetics, the answer to the first two questions, is it alive and is it human, is usually very clear. Yes, obviously. Modern science has left the pre-Roe theory of a fetus being a clump of cells helplessly and irrevocably outdated. Well, is it a person then? The legal definition of a person, not the philosophical, but the legal definition, is this: a human being that has a set of moral and legal rights, most importantly the right of inviolability. That is, the right not to be harmed. But this legal definition does not tell us which humans should have this set of rights. In history, different groups of people have routinely been denied them. For the answer to that question, we must turn to, as even the law turns to, philosophy and ethics. A helpful philosophical definition of a person, not the legal but the philosophical, is this: a person is a being that is alive, human, and has the further ability or capacity X, whatever that X might be. A perfectly legitimate position would be to waive this last requirement as superfluous and simply say that if it's alive and human, it's a person, period. No further is required. But for the sake of argument, what could this X be? Is it the ability to think? Is it the ability to plan, to look towards the future? Or is it a physical ability like a heartbeat or sensitivity to pain? Is it perhaps viability? In other words, the ability to survive outside the mother's womb. Is that what makes someone a person? It gets even more complicated than this. Is it a single ability or a combination of multiple abilities? Further, what about beings with the intrinsic potentiality for this ability or abilities, like embryos, or beings that have lost this ability or abilities, like the brain did? Are they persons? Further still, even if the criteria of personhood were all met, one might still want to legalize limited abortion for a sufficiently serious reason. How so? Well, in a hierarchy of rights, conflict might arise. It's possible that the rights of some other person or entity may trump, and I use this word cautiously, the baby's right of inviolability. Such a person or entity has been the baby's mother, as in Canada or the US, her father, as in ancient Rome, or even the state, as in China. Cognition, intentionality, heartbeat, pain sensitivity, consciousness, viability, and so on, all have been proposed and defended as the X that entails personhood. For different reasons, which we don't have to go into now. After all, I'm not trying to convert you, and it's not central to the argument that I want to make today. I lean towards thinking that they all fail. They're all either arbitrary or lead to intolerable absurdities. Take the viability argument, for example. I think it's an inherently racist and colonialist idea, because it entails that privileged babies born in richer and medically more advanced Western countries reach personhood, quote unquote, before babies born in poorer and less advanced countries. And colonial babies of past centuries reached personhood before their indigenous contemporaries did. After all, they had, and sometimes still have, a far higher chance surviving outside the womb earlier. But as I said, this is not a point I wish to press here. Rather, my argument is this. The question, what is it, is not a religious question, but a scientific, philosophical, ethical one. And the answer to it is not a religious answer, or it doesn't have to be, although it is based on a value system. And this explains, I think, the first striking implication that we made earlier, the growing number of pro-life atheists. Pro-life is not a religious stance because the nature of unborn babies, what is it, is recognizable by anyone who educates themselves and visible to all who have the eyes to see. Religion or lack of religion has nothing to do with it. Common sense suffices. Scripture is virtually or almost virtually silent about it. The Bible may be virtually silent, there's some debate on that, but Christian tradition does of course take, and has from the very beginning taken, for granted that abortion is infanticide. This basic assumption underlying this Christian tradition is that obviously unborn babies are human, and this assumption has not been based on any special revelation found only in the Bible, if at all. The sociologist and historian Dr. Rodney Stark has shown that one factor propelling the rise and popularity of early Christianity, especially among women who were overrepresented in the early church, was Christianity's protection of children in and outside the womb. Christianity's ethic was countercultural. We can well contrast it with the attitude expressed in the famous letter written by a first-century Roman soldier named Hilarion to his pregnant wife. Know that I am still in Alexandria, and do not worry if they come back and I remain in Alexandria. I ask and beg you to take good care of our baby son, and as soon as I receive payment, I shall send it up to you. If you deliver a child before I come, if it is a boy, keep it. If a girl, discard it. You have sent me word, don't forget me. How could I forget? I beg you not to worry. The contrast here between not only his ethic and that of Christianity, but also between his concern for his wife and son and the utter disregard of daughter could not be more palpable. He doesn't even miss a beat. Her death sentence is as insignificant as an item on a grocery list. Don't forget to buy milk, or on a mundane to-do list. Remember to bring out the trash. Trash is actually not far from the truth of the matter. In a recent excavation of a villa in the port of Ashkelon, archaeologist Lawrence Steger and his colleagues made a, quote, gruesome discovery in the sewer that ran under the bathhouse. The sewer had been clogged with refuse sometime in the 6th century AD. When we excavated and dry-sieved the desiccated sewage, we found the bones of nearly 100 little babies, apparently murdered and thrown into the sewer. Later, inscription revealed that they were all newborns, probably day-olds, and most likely all female. I said that the Christian church has always assumed that unborn babies are, well, babies. Indeed, the ancient Romans and Greeks shared this assumption. There was no disagreement about it. No disagreement about the nature of the organism growing inside a mother's womb. It was a baby, a boy or a girl. In one sense, we have regressed from the Roman soldier's worldview. It may not have been ethical, but at least it was scientific. He at least knew what a fetus was and didn't invent pseudo-scientific theories to serve as a moral alibi for his skewed priorities and ethical small-mindedness. He needed no excuse. The modern infanticider, in contrast, has resorted to dehumanizing language about preborn babies. Instead of fetus being a medical technical term to differentiate babies inside the womb from those outside the womb, the term has smuggled in metaphysical and mythological assumptions. So that now when we think of a fetus, we think of a pre-human or a subhuman organism that is less than fully human, as if its location in or out of amniotic fluid had any bearing on the kind of thing it was. The atheist pro-choice philosopher David Boonin and the like-minded pro-choice ethicist Peter Singer take a different route. Boonin and Singer advance quite disturbing ideas, but their honesty and their logical consistency in a world of obfuscation is absolutely refreshing, I think. In his new book, Beyond Roe, Why Abortion Should Be Legal, Even If the Fetus is a Person, Boonin defends the argument that, well, abortion should be legal even if the fetus is a person. Peter Singer goes even further in his support for limited infanticide during the first few years of the newborn baby's life. His classic study, Practical Ethics, draws from the examples of past non-Christian societies to remind readers that, quote, our present absolute protection of the lives of infants is a distinctively Christian attitude rather than a universal ethical value. Christianity introduced no new specific scientific breakthrough in embryology, but rather an ethical principle, radical equality. Everyone, every group of people has valuable and worth and is worth of respect and protection. The poor, the disabled, girls, women, even babies and infants. With this, as you may have noticed, we've already moved deep into the analysis and answer to the second big question that we had, which was, can you kill it? Though it's still not a specifically religious question, here the religious connection becomes more obvious. And this, I propose, explains partly the second striking implication we made at the outset. Religious people are overrepresented among the pro-life camp. Once, and only once, we've established that the organism living, growing, and eventually kicking inside a mother's womb is a human being, the command, thou shalt not murder, kicks in. You may perhaps guess what I'm going to say next. Thou shalt not murder is not a specifically religious principle. Killing an innocent human being is not wrong because the Bible says so. The Bible says so because killing an innocent human being is wrong. And yet, the fact that the Bible does say so, the fact that Christian tradition confirms and repeats it, gives religious Christians added motivation to follow this principle and to apply it indiscriminately. Christian motivation is supercharged, if you will, by love for God. If you love me, Jesus told his followers, keep my commandments. Though abortion is not, I think, primarily a religious issue, biblical and theological language can indeed be employed to describe it. Theologically speaking, abortion is a morbid reversal of the gospel, a perversion of the good news. The gospel says, I died for you. Abortion says, you die for me. If this sounds harsh, we may hope that the genuine, uncorrupted gospel is true, that God is a God of love and mercy. Christianity claims rather outrageously, if you think about it, that whether corpses clog our cupboards, sewers, or conscience, not a single sinner falls outside the range of God's mercy and love. No sin is unforgivable, not even infanticide, not even mass infanticide. This too, may I suggest, might play a part in explaining the statistics with which we began, namely the overrepresentation of religious pro-life people. Many of them, many of us, are converts. Converts either to the pro-life cause or to Christianity through the pro-life cause. Christianity provides a framework that makes sense of the senselessness and offers tools to overcome and recover from it. The basic stance of religious pro-lifers is not or shouldn't be so much one of chastisement of pro-choice, but primarily of merciful and loving appeal in the light of God's mercy and love. What other system of thought, what other body of grace has the stomach to face squarely and the limbs to handle gracefully such a sad, systematic, and prolonged human rights violation, analogous to a silent ethnic cleansing? Among the more high-profile converts to the pro-life cause, and through the pro-life cause eventually to Christianity as well, were both Dr. Bernard Nathanson, the pioneering abortion doctor and co-founder of NARAL, and Norma McCorvey, the original plaintiff in Roe versus Wade. And I close with them. In his autobiography, Hand of God, Dr. Nathanson confessed to having fabricated crucial statistics in order to hasten the public acceptance of abortion in America. But his own views changed radically and rapidly. In 1973, less than 1 year after Roe versus Wade, he wrote, "I am deeply troubled by my own increasing certainty that I had in fact presided over 60,000 deaths." He closed shop permanently, but the memory of the thousands of babies he had personally aborted, including his own child, would continue to haunt him. At the time of writing his autobiography, he was waiting to be received into the Catholic Church, crushed by remorse. He thought of meeting God one day, he wrote, absolutely terrifies me. In 1996, he was baptized. When later asked about his conversion, he replied, "No religion matches the special role of forgiveness that is afforded by the Catholic Church." Norma McCorvey also radically changed her mind about abortion. She felt that she had been manipulated by her two attorneys. She quit her job at an abortion clinic and became a leading activist in the anti-abortion movement, dedicating the rest of her life to repealing the Supreme Court's ruling. Her own involvement in that ruling, she wrote, had been the biggest mistake in my life. Some realization had triggered a shift in her thinking. And I felt crushed under the truth of this realization, she wrote in her autobiography, Won by Love. I had to face up to the awful reality. Abortion wasn't about products of conception. It wasn't about missed periods. It was about children being killed in their mother's wombs. All those years I was wrong. Signing that affidavit, I was wrong. Working in an abortion clinic, I was wrong. No more of this first trimester, second trimester, third trimester stuff. Abortion at any point was wrong. It was so clear, painfully clear. Norma McCorvey was baptized in 1995 by an evangelical minister, and 3 years later she too was received into the Catholic Church. She too had found forgiveness and healing through religion. And she passed away a few years ago in 2017. What had been the trigger, the realization that had crushed her all those years ago and opened her eyes? It was a baby. I was sitting in Operation Rescue's offices when I noticed a fetal development poster. The progression was so obvious. The eyes were so sweet. It hurt my heart just looking at them. I ran outside and finally it dawned on me. Norma, I said to myself, they're right. I had worked with pregnant women for years. I had been through 3 pregnancies and deliveries myself. I should have known. Yet something in that poster made me lose my breath. I kept seeing the picture of that tiny 10-week-old embryo, and I said to myself, that's a baby. It's as if blinders just fell off my eyes and I suddenly understood the truth. That's a baby. Now, having heroically listened to the end of this talk and remembering the original question that was the title of this talk, is abortion a religious issue? I hope you picked up on the tentative double answer which I have proposed today. First, that the judgment as to whether abortion is right or wrong is not a religious issue. It's an ethical and a philosophical one. And second, that religious convictions can nevertheless greatly motivate the pro-life cause. And pro-lifers who initially have no such convictions can end up coming to them. In other words, my answer was no and yes, not really, well, kinda.